paceți știm noi din vremuri strămoșe.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 8th of March, 2026, and we are a week in to the war between the US and Iran. Now, tonight I'm going to be doing, as you can see from the screen, something a little bit different, which is I'm going to be taking you through a presentation that I've prepared for this particular episode, which is designed to illustrate the problems that the US imperialists face in actually achieving what they have defined as a victory. So before we get started, first of all, I will talk to you a little bit about the conditions of victory that the US imperialist leaders, Trump, Rubio, etc., have talked about. Before we get to that, I will, of course, address the question of the name change on the channel. Now, I've talked about this to the subscribers on Patreon quite extensively, but aware that people might have been caught unawares by this. So the channel is now called Liberation News Network. And that is the title of the Twitter account as well, and the Rumble account. I am currently in the process of trying to change the name on Twitch, but that presents certain problems which I won't bore you with now. But the reason for the name change is quite simple. I'm looking to take the analysis that you can find on this channel to a wider audience. Now, this doesn't mean dumbing it down. This doesn't mean dropping any of the Marxist-Leninist analysis that I put forward here. But the previous channel names, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Institute, was, first of all, it was too long. Second of all, it exists in a world where communist names are reflexively suppressed by the algorithm. And I did a brief experiment with the Rumble channel where I renamed that, and suddenly the viewing figures went up significantly. So I think in order to bring in a wider audience, I think this change is more than justified. Of course, welcome your thoughts on this if you have things that you want to say about it. But again, like, the content will not change in terms of politics, but I am looking to professionalize things slightly. Hence the presentation here. The presentation, by the way, the PowerPoint here will be uploaded to the Patreon site along with the audiogram of this episode. So if you're a subscriber on Patreon, you get the presentation to follow along with the audio-only version of this. So yeah. Now, administrative business aside, we're going to get to the issue at hand, which is the imperialist attack on Iran and whether the US imperialists actually have a chance of obtaining the victory that they have defined. Bear in mind, what they define as victory shifts all over the place and constantly. Now, at the beginning of this war, Trump or Trump's handlers defined victory as this in rather broad terms, such as the dismantling of the nuclear weapons program, which Trump claimed to have completely destroyed anyway last June in Operation Midnight Hammer. By the way, the impression of Trump will now reflect how Trump is, which is that he's always on the verge of falling asleep and looks like he's about to drop dead. The destruction of Iran's missile system, the destruction of the Iranian Navy, and it sort of was ambiguous on regime change. Since then, the victory conditions have shifted. Trump is now demanding unconditional surrender of Iran, which is, of course, something that will not happen. But that's now the victory condition that he is putting out there. And as he is, apparently, the commander-in-chief of the US Armed Forces, then it's something that we are obliged to take seriously. And so this is what we're going to be looking at tonight, is the possible victory scenarios. Now, I'm aware that there will be variations of these, and that this is the main ones that I could think of in terms of the potential for US imperialism to actually obtain some kind of victory in Iran. Now, I'm going to go through this piece by piece. Now, if you have questions, be sure to either submit them here, or if you want a more extensive discussion, submit them on email or on Patreon, and I'll pick them up in the next weekly Q&A. So the question before us then is, well, can US imperialism actually win? Now, the case I'm going to outline to you here, and I want to be direct from the outset, is that the question before us is not whether the US wants to defeat Iran. That much should be obvious. The American ruling class, the Trump administration, the Pentagon brass, they all want that victory with a desperation that is absolutely religious. And if you doubt the religious aspect of this in terms of the ideology of this decaying empire, Just look at the bunch of Christian fascists that surrounded Trump to pray for him and just a few days ago. Now, I'm not Chris Hedges. I'm not about to tell you that Christian fascism is the dominant force in the United States, but Christian fascism has been a significant force in all of the imperialist projects all the way around the world. It's a significant force within each of the imperial core nations. It's just that in the case of the US, it's much more pronounced. So the question, though, over in the case of Iran is not whether they want to win, it's whether they can. And the answer is grounded in the material realities of late-stage imperialism. And that answer, of course, is no, they cannot. Not because of Iranian resistance alone, though that, of course, is proving to be very formidable, but because the very structure of American imperialism has rotted away from within, just as British imperialism did before it. So the presentation I'm about to take you through here will be an hour in length, and we will examine the material constraints of US imperialism, the withered industrial base, the chokehold on rare earth metals that the Chinese hold, the impossible mathematics of the manpower question, and we will also examine the political constraints on US imperialism, the crisis of illegitimacy, the impossibility of mass mobilization in this late-stage imperialist system, the fracturing of Trump's coalition, and we will examine what pathways remain open to the US imperialists and why each of them leads not to victory, but only to a deeper crisis. So beginning then, as always, with the Marxist method, and more specifically the Marxist-Leninist method of analysis. Lenin taught us that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism, finance capitalism. But what happens when the monopoly power of the imperialist states rests upon an industrial base that has been largely dismantled, outsourced, offshored? What happens when the so-called arsenal of democracy becomes merely a showroom of financialization? We must understand that the US war against Iran is not taking place in 1945, 1965, or even in 2003. It is occurring in this year, 2026, after 40 years of deindustrialization, after the transfer of much productive capacity from the imperial core nations to the global south, after the financialization, the comprehensive financialization of the US economy has reduced manufacturing output to a rounding error in GDP calculations. The American bourgeoisie tells us that the US military remains the most powerful in history. And in a sense, this is true. It possesses more aircraft carriers, certainly, but those are just now beginning to be seen as just rather large targets. It has more global bases than any of its near rivals, but military power is not something, and war is something which does not happen in the abstract. It is based on real concrete relations, we draw there from, of course, the famous dictum of Clausewitz. It requires, that is, the war machine requires steel, aluminium, rare earth metals. It also requires skilled workers, mass production lines that can be scaled up in the case of full-scale war. And these material foundations have been eroded by the very capitalist logic that the imperialists love to defend. So we will begin then by taking in the first constraint on the US, which is China's dominance in rare earth metals. So we are witnessing here something which is almost unprecedented, in fact, might well be completely unprecedented, and that is the control over the supply chain of rare earth metals by the Chinese. The weaponization of this supply chain by a rising socialist power against the declining imperialist hegemon. The People's Republic of China controls 90% of rare earth metal processing. 90%, that is. Not because of some kind of accident of geology, but because of Chinese strategic planning, state investment, and long-term thinking that the imperialists cannot replicate. Now, an F-35 fighter jet requires 435 kilograms of rare earth metals. A nuclear submarine requires 1.5 tons of them. These are not mere decorative additions. They are essential to the avionics and targeting systems, the stealth capabilities, the very functioning of modern warfare. And the US can't produce them, not in sufficient quantity anyway, not with current technology, and not on any timeline that would enable them to win this war. The People's Republic of China has imposed explicit export bans on rare earth metals for military usage. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. This is active strangulation of the US's supply chain. And again, very deliberate policy on behalf of the Chinese. It's very low key, but its effect can well be devastating, especially now. Now, the Pentagon's own war games indicate that US forces will exhaust critical munitions within 1 to 2 weeks of high intensity conflict. Now, this in some estimates 1 week. So this is why the so-called smart munitions that the US has been trying to use against Iran are now being rationed. And it's also why they're using so-called dumb bombs to bomb civilian areas in Iran, because the stockpiles of the so-called smart munitions are running low already. So the Trump administration has announced a $12 billion strategic stockpile initiative for rare earth metals. They've also announced an additional $50 billion to go to the military to refresh stockpiles of weapons. They have invoked the Defense Production Act, but these are PR moves. They're not solutions. They're admissions of structural bankruptcy. Building domestic rare earth capacity requires years. It will require at least a year of intense work for any meaningful production to occur. Now, a war with Iran requires sustained operations immediately, now. That is a fatal mismatch on the timeline. But this is only one expression of a US imperialist industrial decline. So let us go further and onto our next slide here, entitled The Withered Arsenal. Now, the US produces fewer than 10 major warships annually. China produces over 30. This is not merely a quantitative difference, it is a qualitative transformation in the global correlation of forces. The shipyards that built the Liberty ships, that constructed the naval power that enforced American hegemony throughout the 20th century, these are all gone. These are replaced by, well, nothing really. These are replaced by the financial services industry and the rust of deindustrialization. Artillery shell production for the Ukraine war exposed the depth of this crisis. The US could not supply their own proxy against the Russians without significantly depleting their own shell reserves. In fact, they ended up going around the world begging for shells because they couldn't scale up production enough to keep Ukraine supplied. And that was with them opening up a plant in, I believe it was Texas, run by Turkish specialists, because they don't have the human expertise to run production lines at a war level. The Russians have that. The Chinese have that. In terms of, for certain things, the Iranians have that as well. The US does not. Israel doesn't either, by the way. Now, scaling for the needs of for ammunition against Iran, a nation of 90 plus million people with very sophisticated asymmetric warfare capabilities, with sophisticated regional allies such as Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, who are currently coordinating a freeway assault on Israel, would require the US to engage in an industrial mobilization on a scale impossible, where without the very infrastructure that has been dismantled. And as I said, where's the workforce? Where are the specialists? Where are the tool makers, specialized welders, aerospace technicians? They've either retired or they've gone into other areas of employment. Largely, a lot of the people that used to make up the skilled workers in the US munitions plants have retired. That's why they had to bring a load of guys back to try and make munitions for Ukraine. Now, the skills, their skills that used to be transmitted through apprenticeships and collective experience have all been lost as the munitions companies, the military-industrial complex, chased short-term profits and stock buybacks, getting rid of much of their accumulated experience of their workforce. Now, the American ruling class tells us that innovation will solve these problems. You keep seeing Trump going on TV proclaiming that victory is around the corner. Iran has already surrendered. We've got the greatest stock. we have the greatest stockpile of innovation and this and that around the world. But none of this is true. What the American leaders are engaging in is just simply idealist mystifications. War is a material process. It requires matter to be transformed by labor. And the US ruling class has severed itself from the labor processes that even create the means of destruction they would need to win a war against Iran, never mind winning a war against China. Now, you cannot escape this trap. Now, the bit added to this is the problem of like, well, even if Trump gained the ability to govern, shall we say, even if Donald Trump gained the ability to like put together a plan of production that would take US industry forward, and like build the kind of like machinery that would need that they would need, build the kind of industrial production they would need to resupply their army against Iran. The biggest resistance he would face would be from the US ruling class itself. The US ruling class makes its money how? Not predominantly through the production of commodities, but through the export of capital. And the model that they have is for perpetual stock buybacks, boosting of the share price, payouts to the top executives and the big shareholders, and keep the money going around. If you break that up, you risk systemic collapse. This is the thing. The imperialist economies function on this with all the fictitious capital floating around within them, as long as nobody disrupts the flow, as long as nobody disrupts the oil flows, as long as nobody disrupts the capital flows, as long as nobody disrupts the dollar flows, then things function. The moment anything in this machine goes wrong, then things start to fall apart really quickly, or certainly can fall apart really quickly. So even if Trump wanted to put into place the ideas of like his associate, like Peter Navarro, who at least had some understanding of the problem that the US is facing, the biggest resistors would be Wall Street. That's the thing. This is not a matter of like, people just a matter of like elites scheming against each other. It's a matter of the fact that the US is now in an insoluble contradiction. They try and address this problem by properly reindustrializing. And remember, a military production base can't be built just separate to the civilian economy. You pull any of the strings on the US imperialist setup right now, it'll start to fall to pieces. And this is the reason why they don't know which way to go forward with this war against Iran. And we'll cover their options in just a moment. But here we go beyond the constraints placed by closed down factories, lack of raw materials, etc. Now, the most fundamental resource of any war is the soldier, the sailor, the airman, etc. And here we encounter the second great contradiction. The imperialists need mass mobilization and cannot achieve it under the current political setup. Now, let's be precise about what a victory against Iran would require, not the limited objectives announced by Trump, such as degrading nuclear facilities, reduction of Iran's regional influence, etc. These are, well, Trump's already himself abandoned those goals. He's demanded unconditional surrender, as the real objective has always been to destroy the Islamic Republic itself. Now, regime change would require control of Iranian territory. Territorial control requires ground forces, and ground forces for the United States, even with its supposed allies, just don't exist in sufficient numbers. The active duty US military currently numbers 1.3 million. Now, the army, which would actually have to do the fighting on the ground, roughly numbers are to 480,000. Now, occupying Iran, a country the size of Western Europe, a country larger than the state of Alaska, with very mountainous terrain, over 90 million people in its population, and a tradition, or a very proud tradition, of resistance to foreign occupation and domination, would require, by historical counterinsurgency ratios, between 500,000 to 1 million troops. And 500,000 would be the absolute low end. You're looking at towards 1 million to pull this off. Those forces do not exist under the current US political military setup, nor can the US actually get hold of them anytime soon. So the National Guard, which exists in of course, this is the weekend, supposedly weekend soldiers, that is not the states. National Guard is nominally under the control of the governors, but of course, the National Guard is also integrated into the Department of Defense, and the president can lay claim to usage of the National Guard for service overseas if needed. This is certainly what happened in the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. But so they have 440,000 personnel in the National Guard. Many of these are already deployed by Trump on operations around the US border. They're involved in disaster response. They've also been deployed to do domestic law enforcement, but again, by the Trump administration. Now, many of the National Guard units actually lack the training and equipment for high-intensity combat. Extended mobilization of the National Guard would devastate civilian economies in rural and working-class American communities, where the bulk of those serving in the National Guard come from. Now, the problem goes deeper, though, and that's a distinctly political problem that we've discussed before on this program, which is that the US has been a volunteer military since the middle 1970s, and the volunteer military was created precisely because the draft had become something which was completely politically unsustainable. The Vietnam War demonstrated that the US society, particularly like the working class and the petty bourgeoisie, wouldn't tolerate mass sacrifice in imperialist adventures. And that was in the 60s and the 70s, when the New Deal coalition remained intact, when the post-World War II US economy was still offering a degree of stability for the working class, when the labor aristocracy in the US was still very powerful, when the ideology of American exceptionalism retained a lot more purchase than it does now. And now we're 50 years later, and life for the American worker has got considerably worse. And the American working class might be passive at the moment, but they loathe and detest those who rule over them. Even if they might have voted for Trump, they loathe and detest the rulers. They don't want to, many of them will not want to fight and die for this system, particularly in a war of choice. Well, it's a war of necessity for the US ruling class, but it looks like a war of choice if you're an American worker being asked to fight and die in this. It's not a war of national defense. Trump's claim that the Iran was within striking distance of the US. This is something which is obviously untrue. Everybody knows that it's untrue. And he could not sell this as a war of defense. They just about got away with that 23 years ago when it came to the Iraq war. They wouldn't get away with it now. So the Trump administration, of course, enters 2026 with its approval ratings in the fucking toilet, hovering between 36 and 41%. Among young male Americans, who would be the primary pool for any conscription drive, approval has collapsed to around 25%. The Trump's coalition that delivered his electoral victory in 2024 is basically gone. If he tried to institute a draft, anything remaining of his governing capacity would disappear. You would, in that case, see mass civil disobedience. You would see people fleeing to Canada and Mexico, and you would see actual disruption in the United States. So in this case, they need, if they want to take out Iran, they would need an army that would number into the millions. They don't have it. And if they try and get it, if they try and mobilize, it would not only take them to get all of the National Guard, which would be a tremendously difficult thing to pull off, and they wouldn't be able to get all the National Guard, but also all of their fighting capacity from all of their bases all the way around the world would need to be withdrawn and placed in West Asia. Then we get to the constraints that we've talked about before, which is, well, where are they going to put all these men? How are they going to land them? Iran retains the capacity to strike anywhere in the region. How on earth are they going to get these people into position? When they've got them into position, where are they going to go? To fight their way to Tehran is a non-starter. They would lose hundreds of thousands in the end, maybe more. So this idea is floating around like the US is going to go boots on the ground is ridiculous. They can't do the things that they actually claim that they want to do. Now, this brings us to our next point, which is about the crisis of legitimacy in the American system. Now, as Marxists, we know that the base does determine the superstructure. That's the economic base determines the superstructure. But the superstructure reacts and is reacted upon by the base. So you have a continual interaction there. And the political superstructure of US imperialism is in a state of advanced decay. Now, the Trump administration does not represent the strength of American reaction, but its desperation. It entered office promising to restore America. You're going to save America. I rebuilt the military in my first. Promising to restore national greatness, to reverse decline, to demonstrate that the US could still impose its will upon the world. Instead, all it has done really is accelerate the crisis facing US imperialism. Now, consider the most recent polling data, not because bourgeois democracy determines our analysis, but because it indicates the relationship between, to use Gramsci's terms, the state and civil society. Now, Trump entered 2026 with a majority disapproval on foreign policy. Among independents, the decisive demographic in American politics, approval dropped to 21 percentage points during 2025. Young voters who had shown some receptiveness to Trump's supposed anti-establishment rhetoric have abandoned the administration because economic conditions have significantly worsened, despite Trump's claims to the contrary. And what are the conditions facing working class Americans? 57% of Americans cite the economy and cost of living as their top priority. Even those America Firsters wanted really are an improvement in their economic conditions at home, not more foreign military adventures. People want jobs, and they don't want to see their sons, daughters, neighbors, friends, or themselves come back in a body bag from a war against Iran. Now, they wanted what was really a fantasy restored, which is that American industrial greatness could be restored whilst retaining capitalism. But this is proving to be completely impossible, of course. Now, the administration, that is the Trump administration, lacks the political capital to absorb the costs of a prolonged war. Casualties, economic disruption, the potential for escalation. These would accelerate the fragmentation of the ruling class coalition that exists behind Trump. Now, Trump's nationalists mostly claimed to oppose endless wars. Even some of them would probably start to have second thoughts if things got to the point where America started sustaining mass casualties. Now, the working class, most of which, by the way, I would say doesn't vote at all, would go into revolt if faced with the possibility of being pressed into service. They might end up with the US having to adopt the Ukrainian method of recruitment, which is men in vans driving around American towns, shoving unsuspecting men into the back and then press ganging them into service. So what we're witnessing in the United States is the crisis of legitimacy that was one of the conditions identified by Lenin as being a precursor to a revolutionary situation. That the state cannot rule in the old way. They're reaching the limits of being able to rule in the old way. Now, the old way for US imperialism was the US would continue its imperialist rampages, but this wouldn't be something that the US population would be required to do sacrifices for en masse. The number of people who actually serve in the US military is a very low percentage of the US population. Most people don't serve in any capacity in the United States. Most people probably don't even know anybody who has, or very few people actually make up the US military. And this means that there's no real appetite here for bringing a draft back. There's no possibility of doing that. And there's no possibility, politically speaking, of Trump or indeed any of his successors. So if we get President Vampire Newsom tomorrow, or President AOC trademark, if they tried to do something similar, they would be met with a similar response, which is fuck no. So they can't do mass mobilization; it would be too threatening. They can't do reindustrialization. That would threaten too many interests of ruling class parasites. So they are drifting in a clueless fashion. Now, the other result of this crisis of imperialism, the crisis in the political system, which has gone on for a long time, is that the institutions which are supposed to govern the United States. Remember, the president is supposed to administer things. The Congress is supposed to govern, but in reality, the Congress doesn't govern. What imperialism needs for a political system is policy that is conducted through executive fiat, and military action doesn't need to be or shouldn't be subjected to democratic checks. So the only people who actually push for constraint over the president's war-making powers are usually like libertarians and maybe the occasional rogue Democrat, like 4 or 5 people in the House and the Senate in total would actually want to constrain the war-making power of the presidency. The rest of the politicians in the Congress just go along with whatever the hell it is the administration wants, whether it's when it comes to matters of war, whether that administration is led by Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama or George W. Bush. Most of these politicians know damn well who is the ultimate paymasters here, and that the ruling class requires that war is not ever subject to real scrutiny. The Democrats have wanted to derail Trump's war drive. They could have done so, or they could have at least thrown a few spanners in the works. They didn't do so because fundamentally it's something they agree with. They just have seen that there is now opening up in front of them the possibility of a real and terrible defeat. And this is the reason why people like Elizabeth Warren are starting to panic. Now, we now go towards the strategic options for US imperialism. So given the constraints that we've just gone through, the withered industrial base, the Chinese control over rare earth metals and their choking off of the US from getting supplied these, the impossibility of mobilizing a large army, and a crisis of legitimacy facing the US political system, how then can US imperialism hope to achieve its objectives? Now, the bourgeois strategists understand at some level that a traditional military victory, such as a mass army of the United States marching up the road to Tehran, is impossible. They have, therefore, been looking to develop some alternatives, other definitions of victory, other pathways that might satisfy the ruling class's requirements without requiring they expend resources that they simply do not have. Now, I will examine these 4 most likely pathways to some kind of victory, one at a time. So, first one would be defined as regime weakening. The regime weakening strategy abandons the immediate objective of a regime change in favor of a campaign of sustained pressure, which is designed to fracture the Iranian state from within. This is not a surrender of their ultimate goal of regime change, but a recognition of the fact that they have immediate constraints that they cannot overcome. Now, the military components of this would involve a sustained air campaign targeting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, command structures, nuclear infrastructure, and military logistics. And there will be a naval blockade cutting Iranian oil exports, which provide, of course, 80% of the government's revenue. They would engage in cyber operations, disrupting civilian infrastructure and financial systems. And crucially, support for all of the internal opposition, be that the minorities in Iranian Kurdish areas or Balochi areas, any student movement that popped up, any force that might challenge the ability of the Islamic Republic to rule the country in a coherent fashion. Now, they would also want to try and exploit any fractures within the Iranian bourgeoisie, within the Iranian government. And the imperial strategists would hope to identify certain so-called pragmatic elements within the Iranian bourgeoisie willing to basically surrender and get, in exchange for their capitulation, get sanctions relief and reintegration into the US global market. Now, this approach would avoid what we've called the manpower trap. It doesn't require an occupation of Iran. It could be conducted with existing air and naval assets. It would be minimize the drawing down on the weapons stockpiles, and it would promise victory through exhaustion of Iran rather than outright conquest. But here we must consider the requirements of this. It would take possibly years, not months. It is far from guaranteed that they would ever find enough traitors within the Iranian governing and ruling circles to sell out to them, and the Iranians have already put the US in a position where that kind of patient campaign is politically impossible for them, because they've already done significant targeting of the US's comprador vassals in the Gulf states and Israel. Israel is getting absolutely battered right now from three angles now, and the Israeli government is suppressing information coming out of the target zones by for the specific purposes of avoiding a panic. Again, according to certain Russian sources, a panic is starting them. So we can see that this more subtle approach probably won't work because they just simply don't have the time to do it. So it's not a strategy for winning, it's a strategy for not losing immediately, because I don't think this strategy would even work. Plus, this kind of campaign would not reckon on the Chinese and the Russian response, who certainly aren't going to respect an attempted US blockade of Iran. Now, second potential pathway here, which is using regional proxies. Now, this would seek, rather than using US troops, it would seek to use regional allies as its ground forces. Rather than direct military occupation, would utilize American proxy networks to achieve a certain territorial goal. Now, the coalition structure here is clear. Israel would conduct deep strikes on Iranian nuclear and military targets, would provide the intelligence. The Gulf states, Saudi, the UAE, etc., would financially bankroll this, provide the bases, and provide some ground forces. Then we would see Azerbaijan, under the Aliyev crime family, open a northern front and hope to exploit Azeri national sentiment in Iran. That you would then get Kurdish forces moving into Iran from Iraq and Syria, and they would also mobilize the MEK, the People's Mujahideen organization, this bizarre cult that's been on the payroll of Washington for many decades. Before that, it was on the payroll of Saddam Hussein. The US role in this operation would be minimized to enforcing air supremacy, a naval blockade, intelligence and surveillance and special operations in advisory and in advisory roles, and also some logistics and sustaining of forces there. This would be like this would be modeled off the supposed Afghan strategy of 2001, with minimal footprint, maximum local proxy utilization, and the appearance of victory without the substance of commitment. But as we all know, the Afghan model ended in a debacle, and Iran is not Afghanistan. It is a very well-developed industrialized state with very sophisticated military capabilities, with sophisticated regional allies, and a population that has demonstrated very firm cohesion against the threat of external intervention. The Gulf states' military effectiveness is very questionable. The war in Yemen demonstrated their extreme limitations, such as their dependence on foreign mercenaries, their inability to sustain operations without American and British logistical support. And we add into this that Iranian nationalism does tend to transcend ethnic divisions, and separatist movements still lack real popular support. And the risk of further regional escalation would threaten the very stability of the proxy regimes in Saudi, UAE, Qatar, etc., that would make utilization of these proxy regimes even possible. This would, of course, further destabilize things. And we're seeing some rumors today, by the way, that with regard to the usage of proxies, the Kurds have apparently thought better of an immediate intervention. It would appear that the Iranian government was very ready for a potential Kurdish intervention. It was counteracted immediately by both Iranian and Iraqi forces, hitting the assembly areas of the Kurdish forces very hard, and hitting them to the point where the Kurdish leaders seem to have thought better of it. Also, my analysis is that despite the fact that there is clearly some Kurdish national sentiment in the Kurdish areas of Iran, that there is also a mood amongst the Kurdish population to resist domination by imperialism. And also the fact that the US has betrayed Kurdish national ambitions in Iraq and again in Syria, and will never grant them that, because that would threaten the very, very important US alliance with the Turkish regime. That means that basically they're never going to get their state. And even the Kurdish leaders must have worked that out by now. But so the Kurdish intervention, which Trump seemed to try to pull out of his arse, has not materialized thus far, thanks to a strong Iranian response. The Azerbaijani intervention might materialize, considering that the Azeri regime, the Aliyev crime family that runs Azerbaijan, has no independent existence. It's been largely a puppet of, well, the British, being the British are the single largest providers of foreign direct investment into Azerbaijan, but with also very significant American influence, Israeli influence. In fact, the Iranians have publicly accused the Azerbaijani regime of hosting an Israeli base there, which is used to launch attacks against Iran. Now, given the close relationship between Azerbaijan and Israel, and the assistance given by Israel to the Azeris in their wars on Armenia, not as much assistance as the Armenian president gave them, by the way. That's another question for another day. But the fact that the Azeris are apparently mobilizing their military, by the way, which has been retooled according to NATO standards over recent years. This is another case of like everybody saying like the Russians are so repressive, and look, the Russians are trying to absorb all these old areas of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The Russians sat there and watched the Aliyev crime family essentially reorient the whole country towards being like a pure Western puppet regime, and didn't do anything. So now the Aliyev is apparently having his, having various promises and perhaps threats made to him by the US and Israel, and I would guess probably the British as well, with regard to launching some kind of attack again on Iran. I would say that that was a tremendously risky maneuver for Aliyev to do. Now, maybe the US has his balls in a vice, and they have various tools that they're prepared to use against him, including, I would say, maybe asset seizure. My guess would be that the Aliyev crime family has significant assets in US and British banks, so perhaps they can use that against him. There will be other tools they can use against him as well. But will he have the capability to mobilize the Azeri army into some kind of action against Iran? Well, maybe he will. My guess is that the other big influence in Azerbaijan, that is Erdogan, will be desperate to avoid that. Not that Erdogan is not a swine who would try to seize Iraqi and Iranian territory if he could possibly get away with it, but he would probably realize is that an Azeri-launched war against Iran would be a bridge too far. The Azeri army is no good. It managed to beat the Armenians only because the Armenian war effort in the war of 2020 was sabotaged by the internal Armenian traitors led by Pashinyan, and they only managed to turf the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh again the other year because Pashinyan refused to provide any assistance. So only wars they've won are literally wars which have been run for them by Turkish officers, which have been benefited from the other side not wanting to fight back, or should we say the other side's leaders not wanting to fight back. Against Iran, it would be a completely different scenario, and it would probably lead to, I would guess, a very rapid Azeri defeat and possibly the collapse of the Aliyev crime regime in Baku. So the US and Israel would be taking a huge risk if they push their puppet into a war on Iran, a war I think that the Azeris would lose and lose quite quickly. So moving then to away from regional proxies to economic and warfare. Now, the third option here, economic warfare, would abandon kinetic operations in favor of comprehensive economic strangulation. If the military cannot win, then perhaps starvation can. This is the logic of medieval siege warfare applied to a 21st century global economy. The mechanism would be a total oil embargo enforced by naval interdiction in the Strait of Hormuz, exclusion from SWIFT, secondary sanctions on any nation trading with Iran, cyber attacks on banking, energy, and transportation infrastructure, containment or the squashing of any regional trade that Iran engages with in terms of Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, any Central Asian country, any channel that might allow circumvention of sanctions. This timeline would aim for collapse of the Iranian system within 12 to 18 months. They've tried a lot of this already, facilitating social unrest, trying to fracture the government, trying to organize either a negotiated surrender or an internal coup. In other words, victory without invasion and regime change without occupation. But again, this approach faces real constraints, such as the fact that it would require global cooperation, including from China and Russia, and you won't get it. The Chinese and Russians have already developed alternative payment systems and have built up a multipolar financial infrastructure. The maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration tried to wage on Iran before 2025 did not work. And Iranian society has, over the years, developed a very remarkable resilience under sanctions regime. So you can't guarantee that this would lead to state collapse. I don't think that the Chinese or the Russians would tolerate a globally enforced sanctions system. They would engage in as much sanctions busting as they could possibly get away with. And so the US would be trying to enforce something which it doesn't have the ability to project power to enforce anymore. And again, that would require the US then to step back from kinetic operations in a way that they really can't, because the US has already gone to a huge level of escalation against Iran. They've already killed large numbers of children. They've already bombed the civilian infrastructure. They've already turned the sky black over Tehran by bombing oil refineries. So to step back now and move to try and put in place a siege would itself be an admission of defeat. Now, they've already tried another option, which is trying to decapitate, supposedly, the Iranian system with the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei and other senior figures. This didn't work either. Trying to kill the entire political and military leadership in Iran, where all that means is that you get other leaders and succession plans were already in place. So it absolutely will not work if they keep on trying this decapitation strategy, which is something that both the US and the Israeli regime are incredibly keen on. Of course, they think that they can kill their way to victory, but I would severely doubt that. So this leads us to the next part of this, which is entitled the regime change problem. Now, if we step back from the specific pathways and examine the fundamental objective here, which is regime change, this is the ongoing thread that connects all US-Iran policy since 1979. It's not because Iran has ever threatened real American security, that is, the security of the American homeland, but because the Islamic Republic since 1979 has represented an obstacle to US domination of West Asia, to have total control over oil flows, and it represents an obstacle to them further encircling Russia and China. And of course, Iran demonstrates that resistance to imperialism can actually be carried out. What the US requires is the public demonstration that that resistance is futile and leads to the total destruction of those that do. But regime change here is impossible under the current constraints facing US imperialism. Again, regime change would require territorial control. They can't have that, for all the reasons that we've covered. There's no credible opposition in exile. The MEK is a completely discredited cult, just powered by money from the US. Pahlavi, the Clown Prince, has no popular support whatsoever. No one's prepared to fight and die for that fucker. The ethnic the separatist movements lack the power to actually materially affect things inside Iran. They can do damage, they can create some chaos, but they lack the ability to actually create enough chaos to overthrow the to destroy the government. So the regime change capacity within the American system, their ability to carry this off simply does not exist for all the reasons that we've gone through. Now, going then to our historical materialist assessment here. If we place our analysis in the historical materialist context, what we are witnessing is not merely military difficulty, not merely a strategic challenge, but the working out of fundamental contradictions that Lenin identified over a century ago. Now, Lenin defined imperialism as monopoly capitalism, that is the export of capital rather than commodities, and the division of the world among the imperialist powers as a result of the move to the imperialist system. But he also identified the tendency of imperialism to generate wars for the division and redivision of territory, wars to overcome internal contradictions through external aggression, and wars that expose the system's bankruptcy rather than resolving its crises. The war against Iran is one of these latter wars. It is an attempt to overcome the contradictions of late-stage imperialism, such as overproduction, underconsumption, rapidly declining rates of profits, and the growing challenge of their Chinese rival, which is, of course, a non-imperialist power, which has proclaimed that it is working towards socialism. Now, they are trying to arrest this decline by military means. This is what the Trump administration is now all about. But the military means themselves have been undermined by the logic of imperialism itself. The heavy financialization of the US economy also required the dismantling of its industrial capacity. Shareholder values, the boosting of shareholders' value, demanded the elimination of strategic reserves of industry. The suppression of working class wages and the destruction of the trade unions actually eliminated really the social base that used to give the US imperialists the basis for mass mobilization. The ideology that they've pushed for 50 plus years now of individualism and consumerism has undermined the idea of making collective sacrifice. The very system that demands imperialist expansion has destroyed the capacity for imperialist enforcement. This is the dialectic of decline. The United States cannot win because winning requires resources that late-stage imperialism has eliminated. It cannot withdraw because withdrawal would demonstrate weakness and accelerate the challenge from its rivals. It is trapped in a war that it cannot win against an enemy that cannot be eliminated. And it requires tools to defeat that enemy that no longer function. And who benefits here? It's not the American worker who is going to be facing ever greater assaults on their living standards. It's not the it's not even like the American petty bourgeoisie much anymore. It is only going to be the parasites of Wall Street that would benefit from a victory over Iran. But in my view, given all the constraints facing US power, such a victory is very unlikely to occur. Now, that brings us to the end of the presentation. As I said, the presentation I've just gone through, the PowerPoint will be up on the Patreon site. And so if you're following this along with the audio edition, you can follow along with that as well. Apparently we have some haters on Twitch, which is good. That's why you're on. I'm on Twitch. I'm on Twitch to attract people who are usually lost in gaming and porn. So we have 208 of you watching on YouTube and Twitch. What do we have here on X? We have 487 of you there. That's good. That's great. That's over just over nearly 700 now. Excellent stuff. So talking about other things we've got coming up this week, We have more Decline and Fall coming for you. We had a Decline and Fall episode out for you yesterday. Be sure to go and check that out. We have the latest episode coming up of our Gramsci series very soon. You'll be able to find that on our Patreon site. We will have at least 2 live streams covering geopolitical events this week. So those will take place on at least Tuesday and Thursday, maybe more if the situation requires it. I will also need to get back to covering the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine, because there's a lot of interesting developments there. Now, this brings us to the end of the broadcast for tonight. I hope you've all gained something out of this. Again, if you have questions, be sure to send them through to the regular email address or submit them on Patreon. I will get over to those in the next Q&A session. So thank you to the almost 700 of you who are tuned in right now. And be sure to subscribe to us on all platforms, including YouTube, Twitch, Substack, X, and Rumble. And I will be back with you again for a live stream on Tuesday of this week, barring the need for any emergency broadcasting. So thanks for tuning in tonight, everybody. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, Substack, and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again very soon. Until then, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.